From De La Hoya's record-breaking, jaw-dropping loser's purse to the Conor paycheck that rocked two separate fighting worlds, it's true that even losers are some kind of winners in the world of boxing. So let's look at the biggest losing purses in boxing history, starting with the De La Hoya fight that shattered losers' purse records. Sometimes it's difficult to really wrap your head around just how big some losers' purses can be in the boxing world. At one point, the numbers really do start to look insane. Of course, where better to start looking at big loser earnings than the legendary De La Hoya versus Trinidad, the fight that was dubbed the Fight of the Millennium, and for good reason, as it featured two champions who played at the absolute pinnacle of the sport of boxing, and who fans had been waiting to see go at each other like rabid piranhas waiting for meat. Of course, the two titans of boxing delivered the spectacle they had promised to the world in full, with the fight going the entire distance, covering a whole 12 rounds, and ultimately ended in favor of Trinidad by a nail-biting decision that had both casual and hardcore fans glued to their screens. Sure, the loss must have been sad, but it's hard to imagine De La Hoya being too upset at the loss, given that he walked away with the biggest losing purse in boxing history, coming in at a whopping $21 million, which comes in at around $33 million when adjusted to inflation. Victor, in contrast, got $8.5 million, meaning De La Hoya basically doubled Trinidad's purse winnings. This is a record for a loser's purse that stands to this day, standing as a testament to the sheer amount of spectacle and hype that this fight was able to generate. Of course, such huge winnings aren't that shocking in the modern boxing world. After all, McGregor versus Mayweather literally revolved around money. The biggest UFC fighter versus the greatest modern-day boxer was a fight that was always going to generate an unbelievable level of hype. But what really made the money fight such a big deal was how insane the minimum purses for both fighters were. After all, the winnings had to be able to live up to the fighter's name. The minimum winnings came in at $30 million for Conor McGregor and an eye-popping $100 million for Floyd Mayweather. And much of this came from the showmanship both fighters generated during the press conferences before the fight, hurling insults at each other that you just know they had someone right for them beforehand, and basically telling each other they would end each other's careers. So yeah, you can bet the pay-per-view and streaming revenues were out of this world. Of course, this means that no matter who won the fight, both players would walk away with more money than most people see in their entire lives. In the end, Conor was the one who lost the fight, sliding a cool $32 million inflation-adjusted dollars into his pocket before swaggering away. The craziest thing is how much his earnings come up to when you calculate any additional bonuses or streams of revenue from the fight. Calculations that basically double his purse's minimum amount. Sure, some fans have complained that the fight was more of a money-making stunt than anything else, but we're sure McGregor's wiping away his tears with his millions. So it probably hasn't affected him too badly. Speaking of legendary fights with huge winnings, Joshua versus Klitschko is definitely up there with the advertising greats. Joshua versus Klitschko was a fight that raised more than a few eyebrows on the money front. After all, before Conor and Floyd, this was one of the biggest money fights in years. A lot of this had to do with Anthony Joshua's economic savvy, bringing in an absolute avalanche of sponsors and 90,000 fans into Wembley Stadium, bumping up advertising and bringing pay-per-views and sales to mind-boggling heights. Being economically savvy in the world of fighting is essential for anyone who wants to make the biggest buck out of every fight. And Joshua made sure that both he and Klitschko would walk out of that fight rich. So, how much money are we looking at for the two fighters? Well, the minimum purses came up to an even $13 million for both of them. For Klitschko, this was a pretty solid purse, coming in at around the amount he got for his win over Hayes, so I'm sure he wasn't too upset over his loss. Of course, the money probably stings for some losers. By all accounts, Manny Pacquiao should have exited his fourth fight against Marquez a happy man. After all, his guaranteed minimum purse at the time was $8.595 million. And that doesn't even include bonuses from things like pay-per-view stream commissions, including from international broadcast streams, bringing Pacquiao's ultimate winnings to an inflation-adjusted $30.2 million after his loss. Of course, this purse amount isn't surprising, considering that Pacquiao was essentially the biggest draw to boxing at the time, and was a surefire way for any broadcaster and distributor to earn unholy amounts of money. But the legacy of that purse and that loss weighed heavily on Pacquiao from that point on, with his boxing career never really being the same, culminating in an era where people genuinely believe he had finally been shaken by the loss. It just goes to show that money isn't really everything for boxers. You can come off a loss with a big purse, but what kind of impact does that have on your personal legacy? Of course, sometimes money makes your legacy, like when Mayweather made his name known through some of the biggest revenues in the sport. Mayweather versus De La Hoya was primed to be one of the biggest moneymakers in the history of boxing, and the event didn't disappoint the hype in any way, shape, or form. The fight broke the all-time record for both pay-per-view purchases and revenue, all thanks to the insane advertising talent brought in by these two fighting greats. Mayweather especially drummed up the hype for what would end up being the fight that brought him into the spotlight, running a train of disrespect on De La Hoya that would bring more and more fans on board to watch where their rivalry went, enacting the kind of theatrics he would eventually be known for in his lucrative boxing career. Sometimes it really does pay off to be the villain, literally. Of course, De La Hoya himself had no problem with how well the fight did financially despite his loss, claiming to be ecstatic to be a part of money-making history. Of course, it's no surprise that he'd say something like that, given that he ended up earning $23.3 million through his loser's purse, which adjusts to a mind-boggling $30 million when adjusted for modern inflation. The fortune surrounding the fight would have his legacy set for life, and would also be what paved the way for Money Mayweather's nickname. Speaking of legendary fights, let's not forget the time Joshua overshadowed a world record winning loser's purse. Revenge fights are some of the most popular kinds of fights in boxing history, with countless fans flocking to see how sagas of revenge will unfold. The second fight between Joshua and Ruiz was no exception. This bout would be a rematch for Joshua, who had previously been handed the first loss in his career at the hands of Ruiz. You can bet he was looking for revenge. But more than that, you can bet the hype around the fight brought in a truly sweet amount of money for both the fighters. This was very much true for Ruiz, who ended up earning $9 million for the fighting, placing in some of the highest losing purses in boxing history. However, what really made the fight an economic powerhouse was just how much the amount Anthony made dwarfed his opponent's purse. The legendary fighter made an entire $60 million from the fight. So yeah, Ruiz was probably a little salty with his own purse, even though it ranked pretty highly in the record books.